So what are the characteristics of qualitative research? There is a focus on meaning and understanding rather than an outcome of interest. The researcher is the instrument of inquiry. They act as the assessor and the interpreter of the research. It's generally an inductive process, so we begin with a question that we don't have a predetermined answer for. It relies on rich description, so the more detailed the description is, the more we can learn from the data. The design is emergent and flexible, so we do have a plan when we start out, but we have to often be adaptive to realities as the data collection process ensues. The time is spent in a natural setting, so typically a qualitative study will happen where people live and work who are the topic of the study. One has to have a high tolerance for ambiguity. We often don't have definite answers in qualitative study. And it's important to facilitate the in-depth study of an issue or question or problem and to better understand it. Polkinghorne has defined qualitative research as the study of the experiential realm, which includes people's thoughts, understandings, emotions, beliefs, remembrances, imaginations, perceptions, and other mental performances. This is information that is known to a person, and we as a researcher cannot directly observe it or measure it. Certainly, you can study experiences in a quantitative way by converting them into numbers or scales. But for qualitative methods, we use language rather than numbers. So we rely on the words that people use to describe their own experiences. So the philosophical assumptions, there are kind of 4 philosophical realms that we want to consider when thinking about the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. This is in your textbook, so I'm not going to go into it in great detail. But the 4 realms are about the nature of what reality is, what counts as knowledge in a particular reality, the role of values in that reality, and the processes used to collect data. Very briefly, qualitative research doesn't assume that there's one singular truth. We assume that there's multiple perspectives, and what is true for one person is not necessarily true for everyone else. And that we have to, when we're trying to uncover truth, quote unquote, in qualitative research, we need to consider those multiple perspectives and vantage points. And that knowledge is really subjective as how it's experienced by a participant. And that there are biases in our research. We know that there are there, and we have values that we bring to the table and perspectives, and we have to identify what they are. And again, our design is emergent. It's concerned with studying a topic in natural context and adapting accordingly versus having a pre-specified design that has to be followed exactly. We also talk about different paradigms. And when we think of positivist or post-positivist, that is a perspective that reality is observable and measurable. And where do you think that falls? That's more on the quantitative side. The qualitative paradigm is more interpretive. We have a perspective that reality is socially constructed. Again, that there are multiple interpretations of an event or of reality. And sometimes you'll hear the term constructivism, and that is often used interchangeably with interpretivism. Qualitative research can also be critical, and that is a perspective that is used to argue for change. It's often looking at the power structure. We see things like queer theory and disability theory, and those are critical lenses that we use in research to identify problems and promote change to address those problems. Postmodernism is a little bit different. That's kind of questions the existence of any reality, and it weights all elements equally. We're not going to get too much into that this semester, but we'll talk mostly about the interpretive and critical paradigms. And the interpretive framework. So what is that? A theoretical or ideological lens about that guides the decisions and the approaches used to collect and interpret qualitative data. So even though we said we don't have a predetermined theory, we don't bring a hypothesis to a qualitative research question, but we certainly do bring an interpretive framework. And that is going to inform the kinds of questions that we ask, the kind of people we speak to or observe, and how we interpret our data. And again, some different frameworks are transformative pragmatism, feminist theories, critical race theory, queer theory, disability theory, and all of this is covered in your textbook in more detail, so we're not going to go into all of them in detail today, but just read over them and be familiar with this concept that these different kinds of perspectives can lead to different ways of approaching a research question. So, what is qualitative research? Once again, it is both the theory and philosophy that underlies it, and also the process and approach of using language, and then this process of analysis and synthesis that is based in the theory and philosophy. Finally, we'll go over a very brief history of qualitative inquiry. Qualitative inquiry really emerged in the 15th and 16th centuries and was originally done by kind of explorers, people who went to, it was often Europeans who went to new places, although they're in these cases, non-European groups were characterized as primitive, and it was very grounded in Christianity, in this kind of biblical origin story framework, and they kind of believed that Europeans were superior, so you can imagine the othering of people in other cultures around the world that they encountered in these roles as missionaries or explorers. In the 17th to 19th century, this is when European colonialism was kind of in full swing. Again, it was still, if we think about the researcher being the instrument of research, these studies were, very early studies, were very Eurocentric and Christian-centric. There was a divide among ethnographers at the time between those who were more supportive of the native groups versus those who were more nationalist and more aligned with their the colonial power country. And again, so this is France, United Kingdom, Belgium, like all the empires that had colonies around the world, in Africa and Asia, and South America especially. There was this emergence of a social evolution perspective, and there was belief that cultures had not evolved equally. And again, there was a color hierarchy. This was very grounded in white Christianity and colonialism. Fortunately, this started in the 20th century. There was some continuation of it, of course, and there was a very strong emphasis initially on the positivist paradigm, so an objective description of these different cultures. There were, in the earlier years of the 20th century, there were surveys of American ethnic groups sponsored by religious groups in the U.S., and the first shift towards secularism and away from this kind of Christian-centric perspective happened through the University of Chicago and with the founding of the Department of Sociology. In the 1940s to 70s, we moved away from that to somewhat more of a post-positivistic framework, and there was some colonial backlash. There was, this is also coinciding with a time where many of the former colonies were gained independence. So with that, though, some of these Western European researchers lost, and Americans for that matter, lost access to some of the sites that they would normally study. Think about like the more traditional groups in Africa and Asia. And But there were also new attempts to make qualitative methods rigorous and kind of more on par with quantitative methods. So then as the 20th century continued, more theories and paradigms developed. There was more application and new methods and forms of reporting. And some boundaries were blurred between the social sciences and the humanities. There was definitely increased questioning of power structures, looking at gender, class, race, and this is where we see the rise of critical theories, especially in the 80s and 90s. And then qualitative research today in the 21st century, it's tried to be responsive to the evidence-based practice movement. Qualitative designs are often now incorporated or complementary to quantitative research studies. And but we still need to educate consumers of literature about qualitative methods, especially healthcare practitioners. It's still hard to sometimes get qualitative studies published in prominent journals, often because one of the problems is that the word limits of journals often are challenging to do with qualitative studies because we try to include so much of the original text from the data in our qualitative publications. So there's still some challenges to gain wider acceptance and understanding. However, we've made great progress and fortunately have many different paradigms to draw from than were possible even 40 or 50 years ago. So to summarize, qualitative research has a different philosophical orientation than quantitative research. We use it to study the experiential realm, and historically, qualitative research emerged from ethnography and anthropology, but today really encompasses a diverse categories of methods and perspectives that fall under the qualitative umbrella. And the methods that we use for qualitative study continue to evolve and respond to different factors that come up, like the evidence-based practice movement. So that is all I have. I know that was a rather long lecture, but probably the longest one of the semester. I'd like you to, as an application activity, to watch this TED Talk by Brene Brown, who is herself a qualitative researcher and quite a famous one. And she has a TED Talk on the power of vulnerability. One of the things we really have to get comfortable with in qualitative research is ambiguity, and sometimes that takes being vulnerable, and it's not what many of us are used to. So I would encourage you to watch this and just try to give it some thought and see how it sits with you. That's all I have for this week, and have a great week, everybody. Started to change.